Welcome to the first screencast for Chapter 12, Human Health Risk. In this initial screencast, we'll look at the topic of perceived risk to human health, actual risk to human health, and ways to manage risk to human health. And we'll look at the major categories of risks, such as physical, biological, and chemical risks. And this chapter begins with a case study of a 4 square block area in Louisiana where there was a chemical plant and an oil refinery, both owned by Shell, and the air smelled foul. About a third of the children had asthma, and there were high rates of birth defects and cancer. And this came to the forefront when a middle school teacher organized a grassroots effort called the Bucket Brigade, where they had realized that the only way to prove that their air was polluted was to take air samples, identify the chemicals that were in it, and then present that data to the government, the EPA, the company, none of which had taken any action to protect these individuals who lived there. So they found out that there were 2 million pounds of toxic chemicals in that 4 square block area each year. 2 million pounds. In addition to the 2 million pounds of toxic chemicals each year, there were times when residents were affected in other ways. In 1973, there was a pipeline explosion that killed 2 of the residents. And in 1988, a refining accident killed 7 workers and released 159 million pounds of chemicals into the air. So eventually, this Bucket Brigade grassroots effort did work, and the company ended up buying out residents so they could move to locations where the air pollution was much lower and didn't put them at risk. So this highlights a risk to human health, and it also highlights the issue of environmental justice. This middle school teacher was seeking environmental justice when she tried to convince the government and the oil company that there was an unfair or unjust impact on residents in this lower socioeconomic community. So keep that in mind as an example as we move forward. So next, let's take a look at the objectives for the chapter. First, students will be able to identify and give examples of the 4 major categories of human health risks. These are physical, things such as falling, particularly in a construction accident; biological, which can be a disease such as heart disease, or it could be a disease that is infectious, such as COVID-19. You'll also be able to identify chemical categories of chemical human health risks, such as being exposed to certain toxins or toxic chemicals, some of which we've talked about already, things like mercury or lead. And then a 4th category that I've added in here that's not in your textbook, which is lifestyle. Lifestyle often overlaps physical, biological, or chemical, but it would include things such as smoking, for example. Second, students will be able to identify historically important infectious diseases and emergent infectious diseases. So one historic infectious disease that we've already talked about was the plague, which killed millions of people globally. And an emergent infectious disease would include things such as COVID-19 or Zika. Students will be able to name and identify the 5 major chemical risks. So within the overall category of chemical risk, you have 5 major types: neurotoxins affecting the brain, carcinogens causing cancer, teratogens causing harm to a fetus or embryo, allergens causing an allergic reaction or allergic response, and endocrine disruptors, things that mimic hormones in our body and therefore disrupt the proper functioning of the endocrine system. Fourth, students will be able to explain how scientists determine the concentrations of chemicals that harm organisms. These studies are known as lethal dose and effective dose studies, and we'll talk about how those studies are performed and how that information is extrapolated to determine what chemicals we can be exposed to as humans and what concentrations of chemicals we can release into the environment safely. Fifth, students will be able to identify and describe factors other than concentration that affect the toxicity of a chemical. So this, again, is one of those topics that's not discussed deeply in your textbook, but it includes things such as the person's age. The older people are, the less they are able to deal with a higher concentration, the more toxic a chemical is to them, for example. And last, students will be able to understand and give examples of risk assessment, risk acceptance, and risk management. And also be able to distinguish between two philosophies of risk management. One is innocent until proven guilty, and the other is the precautionary principle, where if a risk looks like it might be a risk, we decide to manage it as though it is a proven risk. Okay, first let's look at the four main categories of human health risk: physical, biological, chemical, and lifestyle. So physical includes car accidents, work-related deaths, particularly in areas such as construction or fishing. Natural disasters, so that could be an earthquake, a hurricane can cause a lot of physical human health risk. Exposure to ultraviolet, X-ray, or radioactivity, all of those being damaging to our cells. Biological risk are diseases. And these, again, may be infectious or non-infectious diseases, and we'll talk a little more about them on a subsequent slide. The third major category is chemical, and that's when a toxic substance, which may be of natural origin or anthropogenic, a chemical that humans have synthesized, causes cancer, birth defects, or disrupts the immune, endocrine, or nervous system. And we've talked before about lead, arsenic, pesticides, and potentially other solvents as being chemicals which can damage these various body symptoms. And we'll look mainly at biological and chemical risk in the next couple of slides. And again, lifestyle, I have that in parentheses because it overlaps physical, biological, and chemical. But things such as obesity, smoking, drugs, and alcohol can affect these other, cause disease or cause harm through these other systems. So, for example, if someone was on drugs or alcohol, they might experience a car accident or a work-related death that might not have otherwise happened. Biological, if someone is obese, for example, they may develop diabetes, for example. And chemical, anything in the medications, such things as smoking and so forth may contain toxic substances or does contain toxic substances, which can cause health issues. Okay, let's look more deeply at biological and chemical risks, starting with biological. First, there are the non-infectious diseases, and that would be things such as heart disease or diabetes. One person does not pass that on to another person. And one organism does not pass that on to another organism, including people. An infectious disease is one that is caused by infectious agents, which are called pathogens. These include bacteria, which are single-celled organisms that you can only see under a microscope, and they can travel from one person to another. For example, there is bacterial pneumonia, and that can be transferred through coughing. A second type of infectious disease, a pathogen, is a virus. And notice we say here infectious agents, not infectious living things or organisms. And that's because bacteria are organisms, but, for example, viruses are not categorized as living things because they do not have DNA. They rely upon they only have RNA, and they rely upon the DNA of living things in order to reproduce. So you can also have, for example, a viral pneumonia, and you can have illnesses such as COVID-19, which are viruses. Another pathogen is fungi. That is a living thing. And, think of things like athlete's foot, for example. That's caused by a fungus. There are tiny organisms called protists. Protists are single-celled organisms that don't fit into the other categories, such as they don't fit into plants or animals or bacteria or fungi. And they typically require an aquatic environment. It can be more typical in, say, a pond, but they can also exist in, for example, dew. But mainly they're aquatic organisms. And then you have things such as parasitic worms. Okay, so here we have, and there is one other category. Let me see if I have that on the next slide. I don't recall for sure. There is a new type of infectious agent known as a prion, P-R-I-O-N, prion, and that can cause Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is also called or known as mad cow disease when it happens to a cow. And it's not a living thing. It is actually a protein, a brain protein that has been folded differently. So it has all of the same chemical components to that protein, to a normal protein found in the brain, but these proteins are three-dimensional, and in the case of a prion, it's refolded in a way which makes it not function. So then the brain cells, and it somehow, which they're not sure how, converts other proteins in the brain to also refold themselves, and therefore they become non-functional. Okay, so they give some examples in your textbook of pathogens. We've talked about pneumonia a little bit already. Other big ones are typhoid, polio. Polio has been, was a big problem until the about 1960, I'd say it was, when a polio vaccine was developed, and that significantly changed. That's one of the first and most significant vaccines ever, and hopefully we'll have more vaccines like that in our health systems. Venereal diseases are sexually transmitted diseases. HIV is one that can be sexually transmitted, but it can also be transmitted in other ways. Tetanus, malaria is a huge killer in parts of the world. It's carried by mosquitoes and greatly affects millions of people each year. Yellow fever and influenza are two others. So infectious diseases that have killed large numbers of people include things such as the plague, which actually killed hundreds of millions of people before the 20th century. And just a number here for malaria, about 1 million people per year still die as a result of this, and most of those are children. And one of the ways to combat that is simply by having mosquito netting in homes or over cribs. Okay, so that's a wrap. We'll have more on biological risk on the next screencast.